All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a fireside chat. We are going to do a quick look at accessibility in the Asia Pacific region and why it's so crucial to prioritize accessibility and how to get buy-in. My name is Jasmine de Guzman. I am the Director of International Marketing here at Monsido, powered by Civic Plus, and I'm so pleased today to have Josh Tseng, who is an accessibility consultant with Etch Empathy in Singapore, joining me to talk a little bit about everything when it comes to digital accessibility. And we were originally supposed to talk to Josh for Global Accessibility Awareness Day in May, but we had some technical issues, had to reschedule. So very excited to have you here today, Josh. And do you want to give a quick introduction to yourself and what Etch Empathy does?
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine. And yes, hi, everyone. My name is Josh Tseng. I'm the Director of Digital Accessibility Services at Etch Empathy, which is a nonprofit organization in Singapore. So, by and large, I guess what you can uh, take away from what we do, we operate in two key services. We offer accessibility consulting, which includes uh, conducting accessibility tests of websites and mobile applications and offering solutions to our partners. So we've worked with government organizations and corporations like Singapore Government Tech Agency, also called GovTech. We've also worked with NTUC FairPrice, which is Singapore's biggest supermarket chain. So people like that who want to rethink how to implement accessibility solutions into their digital services, that's the people who we help. And on the other side, we have training and conducting corporate workshops. So this is quite self-explanatory. We are professional educators in the area of accessibility. And in this regard, we work with key agencies in Singapore, like SG Enable, which is one of the focal disability agencies in the country. So yeah, very happy to share about what we've learned about accessibility over the past year and a half that we've been working in this space. It's all very new in Singapore where I am. So happy to chat about this topic.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Josh. And yeah, obviously accessibility is something that continues to change in the Asia Pacific region in general. We've seen Australia, New Zealand been having more progressive legislation. We're seeing Singapore now with its master enabling plan. Josh, from your experience, how do you think the Asia Pacific region is doing when it comes to accessibility? Do you see a difference in the region from your own lived experiences?
Mhm. So I would say I'm the most well-traveled person in the world, but I've been places. So my father used to work in Hong Kong and China, so I went there very frequently. And probably 20 years ago, compared to Singapore, Hong Kong was significantly more accessible in many ways. But I think one thing that's very encouraging to see is the progress that's been made across the entire region. So Singapore, I think, has been doing a really good job trying to make up for lost time in a sense. So especially in the areas of digital accessibility, I think Singapore has been doing really, really well. And I think you can credit a lot of the progress made to the big multinational corporations that want to headquarter themselves here. So we have, ByteDance, we have Facebook, we have Google, Apple. All of these companies come here because it's easy to do business, and naturally that leads to a lot of our digital services and digital infrastructure becoming better built as they take their learnings with them, because naturally they have a lot of the expertise that was built upon when they operate in many other countries where accessibility has been a much more top of mind issue compared to the Asia Pac region. But every country also has different things that they're good at. So I think one area where Singapore is really trying to make some greater progress is in thinking about infrastructure as a whole, as connected parts, and also in terms of social policy. So that's some of the objectives actually that have been highlighted in the Enabling Master Plan 2030. So Jasmine, you just described that. That's a sort of a guiding principle document and a set of guidelines that was actually created based on multiple stakeholder meetings. So with the in Singapore, we have a term called the people, private, and public sector. So that's describing the social sector, commercial sector, and governments all coming together to give feedback on how we can improve accessibility. But I think we also could take a page out of the book of other countries like Thailand and Japan, who have really been quite forward-thinking in some of their newly introduced social policies. So I think Singapore, in its usual more conservative approach, we are evaluating the options to see what would make sense in our context. But it's really encouraging to see other countries as well make steps forward. And I think its importance from a social, economic, and also just humanitarian point of view, I think these are areas where we really see accessibility being thought of, and it's really encouraging to see.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. Also, because like you said, it takes a lot of different people in society to kind of build together, to think about what parts do we need to prioritize, because we all know accessibility is a journey. It's not something we can address overnight. So how do we fundamentally, what do we prioritize first? Do we prioritize physical accessibility, digital accessibility? And obviously digital is becoming so much a bigger part of our lives. And it's weighing those priorities to figure out what we can address first. And part of that is maybe looking a little bit more about how to advocate for accessibility. And I know, Josh, you did a fantastic TED Talk, and we're going to link to that later on. It's called How We Can Stop Failing People with Disabilities. What was the driver behind you putting together that TED Talk?
So I guess one thing that I realized, well, I guess I also forgot to mention this. This is how much I think about it, but I'm also a person with a vision impairment, and some people might have noticed me. I struggle to look at the camera directly, but yes, or some people may not have noticed at all. But yes, I have a vision impairment, so I'm legally blind. I have less than 5% vision in both eyes, and so as a person with a disability, I've thought a lot about, my personal circumstances, my story, and the kinds of challenges that I had to overcome to do what I do today. Right. So learning in schools was a challenge. I was also lucky enough to be born in a time period where we have the technology to help people like me. So screen readers, like a little talking software basically that reads everything on the screen to me. That's how I'm able to use my phone and my computer. And also the infrastructure that is available to help people like me. So specialists in the area to really guide me on how to use these kinds of assistive technology. But even with all of these tools and help and support in place, I realized, number one, I am really lucky to be where I am today and to have the help that I had. Not everyone, even in Singapore, is or has been as fortunate as I was. And yeah, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And so I realized that I, as a person with a disability, have a voice, and that sharing my stories really does help people understand the disabled community and why things like accessibility is important. And if I never, talked about my personal experiences, people may not know that some websites are not usable to people with vision impairments. And it's not because we cannot see, and it's not because we don't know how to use the technology tools that help us. It's because these websites are not built to be accessible to people with vision impairments who are using screen reader technology, for example. So when when I've been told that, wow, you have all these amazing stories and experiences to share, you should really do a TED Talk. it's it's one of those things that's really flattering to hear. Until you start thinking about what am I actually going to say? And so I thought really hard about it, and I realized that one thing that I really want to do is, of course, talk about this community that I'm a part of. If I have this platform and this community means so much to me, and this cause means so much to me because of where I've been and where I've come from, then I really should talk about this. So the topic itself wasn't hard to decide on, but how I was going to talk about it, I think, was really important. And so one of the things that I wanted to do with my TED Talk was make it constructive to the conversation about disabilities. Like, yes, the title is a little bit instigatory. Let's just put it that way. Like, I am provoking people to think a certain way and maybe even feel guilty, but that's not the takeaway from the talk. So how we can stop failing people with disabilities, by the end of the talk, I try to offer a solution. And so I proposed 3 pillars that we can use to make the world a better place for people with disabilities. So number 1 was accessibility. I think this makes a lot of sense. If infrastructure, policies, products and services, all of these things are accessible to people with disabilities, we can have higher participation rates. We can go to the workplace and contribute that way. We can contribute to the economy by buying products and services online and in person, all that good stuff. But it also has to be led by inclusive leadership. So people in power, like key decision makers and government policy makers, these people need to understand the value of people with disabilities, need to understand our challenges and be there to participate in the conversation and listen and think and collaborate with the community on ways that we can make the world a more accessible place. But a conversation doesn't exist without people from the disability community giving their voice. And so the third pillar is self-advocacy, where we as people with disabilities actually need to accept a certain level of responsibility to speak up for ourselves, because if we don't, no one is going to. So, and I think it's really powerful that people with disabilities can do this using the internet, using social media. I think that has been a really powerful advocacy tool, which me and my team use today. We are active on TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube. So we're trying also to spread our message to as many people far and wide on why accessibility is important and getting them to understand the community. So 3 pillars: accessibility, inclusive leadership, and self-advocacy. I think these are the 3 key ingredients we need to make the world a better place for people with disabilities. And so that was the thinking behind the TED Talk that I delivered, I think in 2020. Yeah.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I can highly recommend to anyone to check that TED Talk out. I found it very interesting. And I think you really touched on an important point there, Josh, because education around accessibility is such a big piece of actually addressing accessibility. It's first, like you said, understanding it, talking to people who persons who do have a disability to understand your lived and learned experiences, and then going out and working together to do something about it. And I think that's where very cool about you is that you've had all these experiences, but you're actually channeling a lot of them into your work at Etch Empathy now, where you guys are doing all this great consulting work, corporate workshops, and as well as social media to get the word out there. But one of the things that at least we run into a lot when we're talking with our clients is the challenge of getting buy-in in your organization when it comes to something like websites or digital accessibility. And I know from talking with our clients, there's everything from, okay, we don't have enough budget, or people don't understand. What are the kind of most common challenges that you face when you're working with teams? Is it a lack of education, and thereby why you're doing all the amazing work that you're doing, or is there other factors that play into it as well?
Yeah, so that's a really, really important point. And in many of our workshops, we have a chapter dedicated to the business case for accessibility. But of course, it's one thing to say it in theory, and it's one thing to, in practice, have upper management, have resistance, or for developers to not know how to implement accessibility. So I'll touch on these 2 because I think these 2 come up a lot. So buy-in of management, as you rightly brought up, is very frequently one of the key problems, because when you're talking about a big organization like a multinational corporation, it's not about the lack of resources, it's about the allocation of the resources, right? So it has to stem from some level of willingness to see it as an investment in products, services, and the user experience. And for better or for worse, it really comes down to the scale. So if a company has 100 users online, they really, usually speaking, are not at the stage where they are thinking about accessibility, and I think that's fine. If they can, it's great, but at this stage, usually they're worried about financial sustainability and growing their user base and making sure they make a great product. So and usually they have limited resources like manpower as well. So when they start building and actually gaining these users and actually reaching scale is when we find that a lot of these people start encountering things like customer service tickets, where people with disabilities encounter problems and then they let the team know. And as always, it comes down to whether or not the team is interested in addressing these issues. So when a company reaches a critical scale where it has a significant number of users with disabilities, then I think it's really comes down to making the justification that this is an investment, that people with disabilities do have spending power. It's not all people with disabilities are impoverished, low-income people. Of course, it can exacerbate poverty and socioeconomic factors like that. There's no denying things of that nature. But it's not to say that all people with disabilities are poor. Many of them actually have a lot of discretionary spending and discretionary income to spend. It's just a matter of you facilitating them. And so websites and services like Amazon, for example, recognize this. And so they are probably one of the most accessible e-commerce websites out there. They're not perfect, but they're better than average. And I think you can really see that they value the every customer that they can gain, and that's a competitive advantage.
And I'm guessing word spreads quickly as well, right? So if someone says, hey, Amazon's super easy and accessible to order through, then that's going to spread quickly to other people.
Yes. So we have in Singapore some local e-commerce players. One of them is a really big company called C Group that Shopee is a part of. And so Shopee, after hearing many of their blind and vision impaired customers complain about how Shopee was not as accessible as Amazon, well, which, to be fair to Shopee is a much younger team and product. They have, to their credit, started thinking about the problem and have made some notable changes. And so you can definitely see this word of mouth effect going around. And sometimes it's really about the feedback that the community gives to the team and the decision makers that really influences and makes them recognize the value of customers with disabilities. But you do realize the problem with this approach is that it's very reactive.
Yeah.
So it's kind of waiting for the problem to approach and reacting to the problem when people with disabilities, in some sense, inevitably encounter issues and make a customer service complaint. So the best way to circumvent this problem is to be proactive instead. And so this is the issue of education, as you mentioned earlier. So unfortunately, accessibility is not a topic that is taught at the undergrad level for computer science and information systems courses, which is where the majority of software developers come from. And so a lot of these junior devs enter the workforce having no idea what accessibility is and having never heard of or thought of the term. To them, you might as well be speaking a foreign language, So it's one thing that we are fortunate to have is that the younger generation of working professionals do care more about social causes, so they're more receptive. And I think one thing that we need to be aware of is that it's easy to say that websites are not accessible, but developers themselves also have only so much time and bandwidth and mental space. So I think one of the key things for the future that we need to work on is how to make the topic of accessibility actually more accessible to developers, to make it more understandable and fun and engaging, and to make sure that it's something that they can quickly take and use in their workplace, because these are the people building the digital infrastructure that we use. And so that's actually one of the biggest problems that my organization and my team are thinking about, how to make the topic of accessibility communication effective and powerful, which is why we use things like social media.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And I think you hit a really good point that like people might have heard of accessibility, but it is just this education piece, but not only the education piece of understanding what it is, but also understanding how it's connected to other parts of their work. So like, for example, I can
Yes.
imagine talking to a developer and explain, they obviously very much care probably about user experience and have been taught about that, but connecting accessibility to user experience, or in other parts of the organization, for example, human resources often very much cares about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and connecting accessibility to those. So that's a big thing that I always focus on, as well as like educating people to understand that accessibility has a wider impact. For example, digital marketing teams, they often care about SEO and website traffic, and accessibility obviously plays a role in that as well.
Yes.
So there's so many different ways to kind of counter that, or counter the arguments against, and get that buy-in.
Yes, and I think you also reminded me of a really good point, is that accessibility is not just about catering to users with disabilities. It disproportionately affects them in a positive way, for sure. But when we approach the topic of accessibility with the principles of things like universal design, what we're really trying to look at is how do we benefit all types of users and make an experience that is better for everyone. And I think that angle tends to do better, and is really one of the tools that we also try to use to convince people of its importance, because it's difficult for them, for our audience, to imagine what it's like to be disabled themselves when they're not disabled, which is fine. It's normal and it's natural. But when we talk about how it would make things easier for them to use as well, when we talk about how it would make things easier for their elderly parents to do things online, one of the ways that we try to illustrate this point is have your when we talk to developers, we ask them the question of, have your parents ever used your app?
That's a good
Do they
one.
know
That's
how
a
to
good
navigate
one.
your app? And some of them say, yeah, I'm ashamed to admit my parents have no idea what they do, and when they see my work, they say, wow, this especially in the public sector, they say, wow, your digital service is very hard to use. It's kind of discouraging, but at the same time, it's a reminder that accessibility doesn't just affect users with disabilities.
No, exactly. I think that's a good point. And especially in the public sector, if you're developing apps, it's so important to be inclusive and accessible to all the residents in your population, because some of those apps probably give pretty critical public information as well.
Yes.
Which goes on to my next question that I kind of want to jump into is, what role do you think that like government and legislation should have in ensuring accessibility compliance? I know obviously in the traditional Western world, we have in the US and in Canada and in Europe, and I know also in Australia and New Zealand, there is a lot of legislation kind of requiring. Singapore's moving towards encouraging that through the Master Enabling 2030 plan. But do you think it has a positive effect?
So it's one of those really tricky conversations, and I think we owe it to ourselves and the community to also be honest about it. I recently read an article about the Americans Disabilities Act, right? ADA, and that's I think by far the most famous one, and that's the yardstick that a lot of people use.
Yeah.
And it was actually a commentary and a critique on ADA, and why, when ADA exists, why are there still so many accessibility problems to tackle in the US? And it's not to say that people are bad, or that it's not trying to play a blame game. It's just trying to be a balanced look at
Mhm.
what we can do using the framework that we have, at least from the United States context. And one of the lines that stood out to me in the article was that the requirements under the ADA are not as difficult as business owners often think.
Mhm.
And but at the same time, the ADA also lacks enough teeth to do what the disabled community really wishes could happen.
Mhm.
And so it's this very awkward compromise, but I think to some extent a necessary one, because if we make accessibility legislation and mandates too difficult, then it's just not going to work. One of a few things is going to happen. Either people are just not going to follow it, which is bad all around, or people are going to follow it, but it's going to develop resentment to the disabled community, which is also not what we want. But at the same time, the legislation has to be effective enough to make sure that infrastructure can be reasonably accessible to people. And I think that's the problem, is what do we define as reasonable?
Mhm.
And so I think a lot of really valid and really important conversations are going to have to be had on what this definition of reasonable is. I think that's another one of the potential criticisms of ADA, is that this term reasonable is not extremely well defined, or maybe not as well defined as we would like. But at the same time, it cannot be overly restrictive to the point where it prevents future innovations, or it is overly fixated on one thing at the exclusion of others. That's also not going to be helpful. So it's a very convoluted and long-winded way of saying that I don't know if you'll find the right solutions.
Mhm.
And I think government, to their credit, if we were to be, to be constructive and to give people principle of charity, they do want to do the right thing most of the
Yeah.
time. Yeah, I think this is something that, yeah, it's at the very least for the disability sector, we do see that a lot of policymakers, they feel compelled to do the right thing. It's just what the right thing is supposed to be. And so I think when it comes to the role of government, at least in Singapore, what they're doing, as you pointed out, they are having dialogues and conversations with different stakeholders, like the disability agencies, people with disability themselves,
Mhm.
even the corporations, to make sure that everything can be put together in a reasonable way. And I think the progress is naturally going to be a little bit slow,
Mhm.
but as long as we take steps one at a time, progress is better than perfection.
Absolutely. No, I
Yeah.
definitely think it's also one of those things where you just have to have good faith in people that, hey, if we discover something that's inaccessible, as long as you're trying to fix it with good faith and improve versus where you were historically, that's such an important part of the accessibility journey that people overlook. And when people start tackling accessibility, they just get overwhelmed because it's a big topic, it's new, they want to do the right thing, but they don't necessarily know how. And it's like you said, it's just about taking that first step and then building upon that. Which brings me to how I kind of want to wrap up, because for a lot of people, this is a new topic, or maybe it's not a new topic, but there's always something new to learn with this topic, is at least how I feel. So what's your best piece of advice for someone who's just getting started with either website or digital accessibility? I know you work with clients on a daily basis.
Mhm.
So what do you normally tell them to get started with?
Okay, what I never tell them to do is to read the web content accessibility guidelines verbatim. Don't read it like a book. It's not going to help you. Um, yeah, it's
Noted.
not that the web content accessibility guidelines are not helpful. They are. We do need standards for a reason,
Mhm.
right? It's just that it really does read like a legal document sometimes. It isn't, but it reads like one. And it's going to probably be more confusing than helpful. So I think instead, there's a lot of really good online resources I think Google has some free educational pieces out there. I think W3C themselves, so the World Wide Web Consortium, they are the people who designed the web content accessibility guidelines, and they also have really bite-sized 2 to 3 minute pieces on why color contrast is important, for example. And those are really good starting points because they break down the topic into bite-sized pieces. Yes, it can be a little bit slow and dry, maybe put the video on 1.25 or 1.5 times speed. But if you want to understand the technical principles behind why accessibility is important and how to make it in your digital services, I think those are good starting points. I think the second component is to talk to people with disabilities because they have their really rich lived experiences that they can share with you. And if you are thinking, how is my app, let's say, being used by users with disabilities, used by senior citizens, used by people who do not speak English as their first language, let's just say. When we think about accessibility for these types of users, the best way to understand their needs is to observe how they actually interact with the web and to have conversations with them on what they are looking for. I think it might sound a little bit out of left field, but I think the gaming industry actually does a really good job of this, right? The process of playtesting and observing people when they are playing a prototype of a video game, having feedback sessions and focus groups with them. There's lots of videos on how the gaming industry does it. And I think you can observe a lot of parallels when trying to develop digital services. This implementation of user acceptance testing into your roadmaps, I think is really critical. And then, of course, when it comes down to actually doing the hard work, having the right tools. So shout out to Monsido, for example. Having the right tools that you can use to detect and diagnose the issues that you encounter and discover solutions for them. So those are some starting points. I hope that they can be helpful to people who are newcomers in this space. And I think worst comes to worst, if you are stuck, we exist out there, accessibility professionals. We are sometimes almost a little bit of a lonely community. So every time we have an opportunity to talk to people, we're always really excited to help. Sometimes on a casual basis and an informal, basis. So feel free to reach out. Yeah, I think we are not hard to talk to, I would like to think.
No, definitely not. And I have to say the accessibility community is a wealth of knowledge and they're always on it, checking whenever there's new digital developments and noticing and spotting new things. So I definitely think there's a lot of help that you can get from on there. But with that, I just want to say thank you so much, Josh, for having this chat with me. Don't forget to connect with Josh on LinkedIn if you want to chat with him, or you can follow him on TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube. I know I do. And if you're interested in finding out if your website is accessible, we're going to drop a little link somewhere here in the chat, I think, or in the thing. And you can get a complimentary website accessibility scan and we can help you figure out what issues you have on your website and help you kind of diagnose that and get on your way. But thanks so much, Josh, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.